Hello and welcome. Tonight we're going down the Superman iceberg, which is a slightly grand way of saying I'm going to talk at you for a couple of hours about a man in a cape and where all his bits and pieces actually came from. Here's the thing that got me into this. In 1938, two lads from Cleveland sold Superman outright for $130. That's the famous bit. What's less famous is that almost nothing you picture when you picture Superman was in what they sold. The flying wasn't. The kryptonite wasn't. The Fortress of Solitude wasn't. Most of it got bolted on later by radio writers, animators, and at one point a government censor. That's the 12 layers we're working through, roughly ordered from the stuff you probably know down to the stuff you'd only find if you went rummaging through 1940s broadcast scripts. And I'll say now, this iceberg gets stranger going down, not darker. There's a super horse waiting for us. Do bear with me. If you fancy subscribing, that'd be lovely. Otherwise, get comfortable, and let's start at the top. The check still exists. That's the part I find genuinely mad. Not a photograph of it, not a reproduction in a museum display case. The actual piece of paper that bought Superman is still knocking about in the world. And in 2012, it sold at auction for $160,000, which means the receipt is worth considerably more than the thing it purchased. And it's not even a check for that amount, which is how everyone tells the story. It's a check for $402, made out on the 1st of March 1938. And if you look at it closely, there's a little breakdown on it. The bulk of that money was payment for pages delivered. Comic book pages, drawn and lettered. The ordinary work of two young freelancers doing what young freelancers do. And then, off to the side, there's a line item. $130. Superman. That's it. That's the entire transaction. A line item on an invoice. Let me back up a bit, because the years before that check are the part people skip, and they're the part that actually explains it. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster met at Glenville High School in Cleveland. Two Jewish kids, both children of immigrant families, both absolutely obsessed with pulp magazines and newspaper strips and the general business of making things up. Siegel wrote, Shuster drew, and they had been trying to sell somebody, anybody, on Superman since roughly 1933. Now here's a detail that I think reframes the whole thing. They weren't trying to sell him as a comic book. They were trying to sell him as a newspaper strip. That distinction matters enormously, and it's very easy to miss from where we're sitting. In the 1930s, the newspaper comic strip was the prestige format. It was where the money was, it was where the reputation was, and it was where Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers and Little Orphan Annie were making people properly wealthy. A daily strip in a few hundred papers was a career. Comic books, by contrast, were the bin. They were cheap reprint packages sold for a dime, largely staffed by people who couldn't get syndicated and nobody serious wanted to be there. Siegel and Shuster spent years knocking on the doors of the syndicates. And the syndicates said no, repeatedly, for half a decade. The rejections weren't cruel exactly, they were just the standard publishing shrug. This is a bit odd. This isn't what we're looking for. The market's already got its science fiction hero, thanks anyway. By the time an editor called Vin Sullivan came looking for a cover feature for a new anthology title called Action Comics, the pair had been rejected so many times they'd have taken almost anything. Sullivan wanted material fast. They had Superman sitting in a drawer, already drawn, originally laid out as newspaper strips. They cut it up and reformatted it into 13 comic book pages, and off it went. The contract they signed said this, and I'm paraphrasing only slightly because the actual legal language is quite something. In consideration of $130, they sold and transferred the work, the strip, all goodwill attached to it, and the exclusive right to the characters, the story, the continuity, and the title to the publisher, and its assigns to have and to hold forever. To have and to hold forever. That's the phrase in the actual document. It reads like a wedding vow written by someone's solicitor. I want to be careful here, because there's a version of this story where it's a swindle, and I don't think that's quite right. It's worse than a swindle in a way, because it was completely normal. That was simply how the business ran. You did the page, you took the check, you didn't own the thing. Dozens of characters changed hands on those terms in that period, and most of them are entirely forgotten because most of them were rubbish. The reason this particular contract became infamous is that this particular character didn't turn out to be rubbish. There's a line from a recent book on the subject that stuck with me. Siegel lost his father when he was 17. He had nobody to advise him. No agent, no lawyer, no older figure in the industry to say, hang on, read that clause again. Two kids in their early 20s, thrilled beyond words that somebody had finally said yes, and absolutely no reason on earth to imagine that this thing would still be printing money nearly a century later. If you'd told them in 1938 that people would still be arguing about this contract in courtrooms in the 2020s, they'd have assumed you were taking the mickey. Action Comics #1 went on sale in the spring of 1938 with a cover date of June. The cover shows Superman smashing a green car against a rock while men flee in terror, which is a genuinely fantastic image and was, at the time, a bit baffling to the people selling it. There's a story that has been told and retold about Sullivan's colleagues thinking the cover was ridiculous and that no one would believe a man could lift a car over his head. Whether that conversation happened exactly as reported, I couldn't tell you, but the sentiment was real enough. Nobody in that office knew what they had. The sales figures told them soon enough. Not immediately, mind, because the distribution reporting in that era was slow and vague. But the reorders came in, and then the surveys came back. And the surveys kept saying the same thing. Kids weren't buying Action Comics. They were buying the one with the strong man in it. Within 2 years, Superman had his own title, which made him the first character in American comics to be spun off into a solo book. That's a much bigger deal than it sounds. Before Superman, comics were anthologies, bags of assorted content. The idea that one character could carry an entire magazine on his own was new, and it created the template that the entire industry has been following ever since, right up to the shelf in your local shop today. He got a newspaper strip too in 1939. The thing they'd wanted all along, arriving after the fact, through the door, they'd never intended to use. So that's the top of the iceberg. 2 kids, a drawer full of rejected strips, an editor in a hurry, and a line item on an invoice. It's a very ordinary story about how something enormous starts, and I quite like it for that. Nothing about it feels like destiny. It feels like a Tuesday. A couple of small details before we move on because they colour the whole thing. Action Comics cost 10 cents. That's the entire price point the industry was built on, and it's worth holding on to because it explains why nobody in that building was thinking in terms of legacy. You do not agonise over the long-term cultural implications of a dime. The other detail is that the demand became visible before anyone understood where it was coming from. The reorders arrived, the numbers climbed, and the publisher genuinely didn't know which feature was doing it. Action Comics was an anthology. There was other material in there, cowboys and adventurers and detectives, and any of it might have been the draw. It took surveys, asking children directly, before anyone could say with confidence that the thing selling the magazine was the man on the cover with the car. When they worked it out, the pace changed immediately. The newspaper strip launched in 1939, which was the format Siegel and Schuster had wanted all along, and it eventually ran in hundreds of papers. Superman #1 arrived the same year, reprinting the early material and adding new pages. The pair went from unemployable to running an actual operation with startling speed. They set up a studio back in Cleveland with assistants working under them, because a monthly book plus a daily strip plus a Sunday page is simply more drawing than one man can physically do. Schuster laid things out. Others finished them. That's a normal working arrangement in comics, and it was normal then, but it does mean that a fair amount of what people think of as classic Schuster artwork was produced by a room of people working to his design. They were, for a while there, doing genuinely well. That's the part the tragedy version of this story tends to skip. There were good years in the middle. In January 1933, 5 years before any of that, Jerry Siegel published a short story in a small self-produced science fiction magazine called Science Fiction, The Advance Guard of Future Civilization. Third issue, Schuster did the illustrations. The story was called The Reign of the Superman, and all. And the Superman in it is the bad guy. The setup goes like this. A scientist called Professor Ernest Smalley picks up a vagrant from a breadline, a man named William Dunn, and uses him as a test subject. Smalley has got hold of a fragment of a meteorite from what the story calls a dark planet, and he feeds Dunn a few grains of it. Dunn immediately develops an enormous intellect and full telepathy. He can read minds. He can, and I love this detail, intercept intergalactic messages. What does he do with all this? He kills Smalley and sets about plotting the destruction of civilization. Obviously. Then the effect wears off before he can get back to the source material, and he ends up right back where he started, in the breadline, having briefly been the most powerful mind on the planet, and now being nobody again. Bald, by the way. The illustrations give him a completely bald head, which is a detail that gets a lot of attention because of who eventually ended up bald in the Superman mythology, though I'd be cautious about drawing too straight a line between those two things. Lex Luthor arrived years later and had a full head of red hair, for his first few appearances anyway. Still, it's a fun coincidence, and I'm not going to pretend I don't enjoy it. What I actually find interesting about the reign of the Superman is the meteorite. Think about it. In 1933, a rock from a dead alien world lands on Earth and gives a man superhuman abilities. 10 years later, a rock from a dead alien world lands on Earth and takes them away. It's the same object doing the opposite job, and I've never seen anyone claim the writers were deliberately closing a loop, but the symmetry is lovely regardless. Anyway, that story went nowhere, as small press science fiction stories tend to, and Siegel apparently decided fairly quickly that he'd got it the wrong way round. The interesting version wasn't a man given power who abuses it, it was a man given power who doesn't. Now, since we're on the subject of where the name came from, let's do the ancestors, because there are several and they're all a bit tangled. The obvious one people reach for is Nietzsche, the Übermensch from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which got rendered into English as Superman by early translators and has caused a century of confusion ever since. Nietzsche's concept is not a bloke who can lift a train. It's a philosophical idea about a person who creates their own values rather than inheriting them. And the translation as Superman is generally regarded as clumsy at best. But that translation was in wide circulation in English by the 1920s, and the word Superman was floating around the culture as a general term for a superior sort of human being. Siegel didn't have to invent the word, he just had to grab it off the shelf. Then there's Philip Wiley's novel Gladiator, published in 1930. That one's about a man called Hugo Danner, whose father experiments on him before birth, giving him enormous strength, the ability to leap tremendous distances and skin that bullets can't get through. Danner spends the book being fundamentally unable to fit anywhere. He tries the army, he tries academia, he tries just being left alone, and it all goes badly because the world has no slot for someone like him. It's a properly melancholy book, and if you go and read the description of Danner's powers next to the description of Superman's in 1938, the resemblance is difficult to wave away. Neither Siegel nor Schuster ever confirmed it as a direct source as far as I'm aware, but the similarity is right there. Then Doc Savage, who we'll come back to properly later on, because he lent Superman something considerably more specific than a vibe, there's also the visual side of it which people underrate. Look at that original costume. Tights, trunks worn over the tights, a cape, boots, a chest emblem. That is not a science fiction outfit. That is a circus outfit. That is precisely what a strongman or an acrobat or a trapeze performer looked like in the 1930s. And the trunks over tights thing, which modern audiences find endlessly baffling, made perfect sense in 1938 because everybody had seen a bloke dressed like that lifting a barbell at a fairground. Schuster wasn't inventing an alien aesthetic. He was drawing the strongest looking person a kid in Cleveland could actually imagine, which was the bloke from the circus. Put all of it together, and what you get is a character stitched together out of bits that were already lying around. A word from a mistranslated German philosopher, a power set from a gloomy novel about a man who doesn't fit, a costume from the fairground, a structure from the pulps, and an early draft where he's the villain of the piece. I find this genuinely reassuring, if I'm honest. There's a version of creative history where the great things arrive fully formed out of nowhere, and everyone else should just give up. This isn't that. This is two lads magpieing bits from everything they liked, and getting it wrong first, and then getting it slightly less wrong, and then, on about the fourth go, landing on something that worked. The thing that made it work, incidentally, wasn't the powers. It was the decision to flip the moral polarity, take the man from the breadline who becomes godlike and decides to burn the world, and instead make him a farm boy who becomes godlike and decides to help. That's the entire invention. Everything else was already on the table. And here's the bit that always gets me. Even after they'd made that flip, even after they'd landed on the version we know, they still hadn't given him the thing everyone associates with him most. Oh, and one more thing on the mechanics, because it's a nice piece of design that got thrown away. In the original setup, Superman's abilities aren't explained by the sun at all. They're explained by gravity. Krypton was a bigger, denser world with much stronger gravity, so a Kryptonian body evolved to cope with it, and dropping that body onto a smaller, lighter planet produces someone who can do things the locals can't. Action Comics #1 actually spells this out with an analogy about ants carrying many times their own weight and grasshoppers leaping enormous distances relative to their size, which is, and I say this with affection, complete nonsense as physics. But it's clean, comprehensible nonsense, and any child could follow it in one panel. The yellow sun explanation came later, gradually, over the 40s and 50s, and it took over for a very practical reason. Gravity gets you strength and jumping and not much else. It doesn't get you heat vision. It doesn't get you X-ray vision or freezing breath or any of the increasingly baroque additions that were coming. But a sun that charges him up like a battery gets you absolutely anything you like. And it comes with a built-in off switch, because now you can just put him under a red sun and he's an ordinary bloke again. The explanation was rebuilt to accommodate the powers, rather than the powers being derived from the explanation, which is how nearly all long-running fictional science works, if we're honest about it. He couldn't fly. There's a paragraph in Action Comics #1 that functions as a sort of instruction manual. Early comics did this constantly, because they couldn't assume the reader had any idea what was going on. So they'd just stop the story and explain the character to you in a caption box. And that caption tells you Superman can leap 1/8 of a mile. It tells you he can hurdle a 20-story building. It tells you he can run faster than an express train. And it tells you that nothing less than a bursting shell could pierce his skin. That's the lot. That's the whole power set at launch. No flight, no heat vision, which doesn't turn up until 1949. No super breath, no X-ray vision, no freezing things, no super hearing worth mentioning, none of the ludicrous back half of the catalogue we'll get to later. He is, in 1938, a very strong man who jumps a long way and is hard to injure with anything smaller than artillery. 1/8 of a mile, by the way, is about 200 meters, which is a colossal jump by human standards, and an absolutely pathetic one by the standards of a character who would later push planets about, but that's where he started. A bloke who could clear a couple of streets in one go. So how did he end up flying? The short answer is that a cartoon studio thought the jumping looked silly. The longer answer is properly good, so let's do that instead. In 1940, Paramount made a deal to produce animated Superman shorts, and the studio that got the job was Fleischer. If you don't know the name, you know the work. Betty Boop, Popeye. The Fleischers were the great rivals to Disney in that era, and they had a completely different sensibility, heavier, stranger, more mechanical, more urban. They'd also invented rotoscoping, which is the technique of tracing over filmed footage to get realistic movement, and which is more or less the great-grandfather of modern motion capture. They spent something like 6 months on the first short. It cost an absolute fortune by the standards of the day. And somewhere during production, they animated Superman doing his signature move, the enormous bound from rooftop to rooftop, watched it back, and decided it looked ridiculous. Which, to be fair, it does. A leap has an arc and a landing. It means your hero spends most of his big moments falling, and then he has to crouch, and then he has to launch again. It's stop-start. It kills the momentum. And in animation, where every frame costs money, and every frame is a decision, that's an expensive problem to have. They went to National, the publisher, and asked if they could just let them fly, and National said yes. The first short came out on the 26th of September, 1941. It's called simply Superman, though everyone now calls it The Mad Scientist. It got nominated for an Academy Award and lost to a Pluto cartoon, which is a sentence I enjoy typing. Bud Collyer voiced Superman, the same man doing it on the radio, and his name was kept out of the credits for years, which is a strange bit of show business superstition I've never fully understood. That series also gave us the words, faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. Those lines open the Fleischer shorts, and note the third one, because it's a fossil. It's describing the power he'd already stopped having by the time the sentence was written. They kept it because it sounded good. It's still in the culture nearly 90 years later, describing an ability the character abandoned before most people alive today were born. Now I said the short answer was that a cartoon studio did it, and I want to complicate that slightly, because the tidy version isn't quite true, and the untidy version is better. Superman was already flying elsewhere before that cartoon came out. There's an artist called Leo Nowak who was new to the Superman books around 1941, and in Superman number 10 he drew several panels where the bloke is just hovering, clouds behind him, buildings below, cape not blowing, no motion lines, no sense of an arc. He looks like he's parked in mid-air. The general assumption is that Nowak simply didn't know the rules yet and drew what felt natural, which is a wonderfully human way for a fundamental power to enter a mythology. Somebody new on the job wasn't briefed properly. Earlier still, a magazine called Triumph put Superman on its cover in August 1939. Airborne, no leap involved. The radio show had him flying from very early on too, because on the radio, the distinction between a leap and a flight is basically inaudible. You can't see it. All you've got is a whoosh. The truthful version is that the comics were the last ones to catch up, not the first ones to decide. Flight arrived from the edges, from a cover artist and a sound effect and a new bloke who hadn't been told, and eventually the books just went along with it. My favourite piece of evidence for how quietly it happened comes from Superman number 30, September 1944, which is the first appearance of Mr. Mxyzptlk. Superman is chasing him through the sky over Metropolis, and he says, and I'm paraphrasing, that he thought he was the only one who could fly. He's not shocked that he's flying. He's shocked that someone else is. By 1944, it's completely settled. It's not remarked upon, and there was never a story where he learned to do it. The character just quietly gained the defining ability of his entire existence because animating him without it was a nuisance. I think about that a lot, actually. Not because it diminishes anything, because it means the most famous image in superhero fiction, a man in a red cape crossing the sky, exists as a production compromise. Somebody in a Miami animation studio in 1941 looked at a rough test and went, "No, that looks daft, can we just have him fly?" While we're being pedantic about early details, look at the chest emblem sometime. There is no fixed design for the first several years. The shield changes shape constantly. Sometimes it's a police badge sort of thing. Sometimes it's a triangle. Sometimes the S is thin and spidery. And sometimes it's fat and blocky. And the proportions wander about from issue to issue, and artist to artist. It settles eventually into something like the familiar version through the 40s, mainly because the animated shorts and the merchandising needed something consistent to reproduce. And consistency is a commercial requirement long before it's an artistic one. The idea that the S isn't an S at all, that it's a Kryptonian family crest belonging to the House of L, is a much later invention. It's not in the original material in any form. It arrives properly in the modern era, and the version most people know now, where it's the Kryptonian symbol for hope, is more recent still. I have mixed feelings about that one, actually. On the one hand, it's elegant, and it solves the slightly awkward question of why an alien would happen to have a Latin letter on his chest that matches his English name. On the other hand, there's something I rather like about the honest answer, which is that his mother sewed an S on him because he's called Superman, and it was 1938. And nobody was overthinking it. Both explanations have their charm. I just think it's worth knowing which one came first. And once you notice that, you start noticing how much else came in through the same door. Picture the working conditions for a moment, because they explain everything about this one. The Adventures of Superman went out on the radio 3 times a week. Live. No reruns, because reruns essentially didn't exist as a concept for a daily serial in that period. Kellogg's was paying for it, specifically to sell a cereal called Pep, and the show had to be there when it said it would be there every time, with no exceptions and no gaps. If the star lost his voice, that was not a problem you solved by putting on last month's episode. There was no last month's episode to put on. Into that machine, in June 1943, comes a 7-part story arc called The Meteor from Krypton, written and directed by a man named George Lowther. And in it, for the first time anywhere, there's a green rock. Now here's the bit that surprises people. In its debut, kryptonite is not primarily a weapon, it's an identity crisis. The story has a meteor land outside Metropolis, and a scientist called Dr. John Whistler works out that it came from a destroyed planet called Krypton. Clark Kent, who covers the story for the paper, has an extremely strange reaction to being near it. It glows like a green diamond. He goes weak within about 10 feet of it, and crucially, it gives him visions. He sees Krypton, he sees his parents, and he says out loud that he now knows for the first time who he really is and where he came from. That's what the rock was for. It was a delivery mechanism for the origin story. The weakness was the side effect that made the visions dramatic, not the point of the exercise, which I think is genuinely lovely and completely at odds with how we use the stuff now. These days, kryptonite is a plot lever. It's the thing you put in the room when the fight needs to last longer. In 1943, it was the thing that told a man he was an orphan from a dead world. It took 6 years to reach the comics. 6. It turns up in Superman number 61, cover dated late 1949. And even then, the first thing they use it for is, again, telling Superman where he's from. They landed on the same idea independently, or possibly not independently at all, and it took the better part of a decade for the most famous weakness in fiction to migrate from one medium to the other. Kryptonite has an earlier ancestor too, and this is the properly deep bit. Back in 1940, Siegel wrote a Superman story called The K-Metal from Krypton, which DC rejected and never published. In it, a meteor from Krypton passes near Earth, and its radiation saps Superman's powers, while giving those same powers to any human who touches it. So the concept existed on paper years before the radio show. The reason it got binned had nothing to do with the metal. It got binned because in that story, Lois Lane finds out Clark's secret identity, and the editorial position on that at the time was an extremely firm no. Whether Lothar and the radio team knew about that unpublished script is one of those questions nobody can answer definitively. It's entirely plausible somebody mentioned it in a corridor. It's also entirely plausible that two writers working on the same character independently arrived at Rock from Home Planet, because it's not exactly an enormous leap, right? Now the myth, because there's a very famous story attached to kryptonite, and I want to be honest about how shaky it is. The story goes that kryptonite was invented so that Bud Collyer, who played Superman, could take a holiday. The logic is neat. Get Superman near the rock, have him collapse, and now your lead can vanish for a week, while some poor bloke in the booth makes pained groaning noises into a microphone. No listener suspects a thing. Everybody gets a fortnight off. It's a brilliant story. It's in Julius Schwartz's memoir, and Schwartz was one of the most important editors the character ever had, so it carries real weight. It gets repeated absolutely everywhere. But the historian Michael J. Haid has picked at it, and the objections are difficult to argue with. In The Meteor from Krypton, Superman is never actually exposed to the kryptonite. And Collyer appears in all 7 episodes of the arc. He appears in the 2-part follow-up in 1945 as well. If the rock was invented to get him out of the building, it did a spectacularly poor job of getting him out of the building. Where does that leave us? Probably here. Kryptonite was invented as a storytelling device, and at some later point somebody in a production office noticed it could also be used to write the lead out for a week, and over the following decades, those 2 facts got compressed into one origin story that's tidier than the truth. I'll be honest, I'm a bit sad about it. The vacation version is a much better anecdote, but the actual version has a scientist called Dr. Whistler locking an alien rock in a private vault, and a man learning he's not from here by standing too close to it, and that'll do me. One last detail, which is my favourite thing about the whole business. Krypton, the real element, atomic number 36, is a colourless, odourless, entirely inert noble gas. It sits in the air around you right now, doing absolutely nothing to anyone. It is arguably the least dangerous substance in the periodic table. A couple of loose ends on the rock. Since we're here, lead. Kryptonite radiation passes through everything except lead, which is why lead turns up constantly in these stories as either the solution or the problem. Lead-lined boxes to carry it safely, lead walls to hide behind. And the same property is why Superman's X-ray vision can't see through lead either, which gave writers a reliable way to hide things from a man who can see through walls. One material and 2 problems solved, and it slots neatly into the story without needing any explanation beyond the fact that lead is heavy, and everyone already knows lead is used for shielding. The other loose end is that a good chunk of the early radio material is simply gone. The original 1943 episodes that introduced kryptonite have not been recovered. What survives is the script. That's not unusual for the period, because these were live broadcasts and recordings were made for practical reasons rather than preservation, and the recordings that did exist were often discarded. Enormous amounts of American radio drama simply no longer exist in any listenable form. The debut of the most famous weakness in fiction survives as words on paper, and nobody alive has heard it as it went out. The 1945 sequel arc does survive though, and if you've never listened to any of this material, I'd recommend it, purely as an artifact. The pacing is completely different from anything we make now. It's slow, it's dense with dialogue, it repeats information constantly for anyone who missed Monday, and Bud Collier's shift from Clark's voice to Superman's is done entirely by dropping his pitch, live, mid-sentence. It's a proper piece of craft, and they named the deadliest rock in fiction after it. Right, let's do a proper wander through the house, because once you start pulling at this thread, it turns out an enormous amount of the standard Superman set dressing was brought in from outside. Start with the Fortress of Solitude, which is the big one. That name is not a DC invention. It comes from the Doc Savage pulps of the 1930s. Doc Savage was a scientist, adventurer, detective sort, enormously popular, and one of the clear templates for the whole superhero idea that came after him. Stan Lee said as much, and Doc had an Arctic hideaway he called the Fortress of Solitude, where he'd go alone to work on scientific breakthroughs and to store the dangerous things he didn't want anyone else getting hold of. The Golden Age Superman had no Arctic anything. He had a mountain sanctuary in the hills outside Metropolis, which is a much more modest proposition. A hideout. He kept a diary there, and some oversized tools and various trophies from cases, like a slightly odd man with a shed. The Arctic version, the one everybody pictures, the Crystal Cathedral in the ice, doesn't arrive until Action Comics number 241 in June 1958, 20 years after the character debuted. And when it does arrive, it comes packed with a level of eccentricity that modern versions have largely dropped. There was an alien zoo. There was a giant steel diary that he wrote in using his invulnerable finger, or sometimes his heat vision, because obviously a pen wouldn't work. There was a chess-playing robot. There were rooms dedicated to each of his friends, and magnificently, a room dedicated to Clark Kent, to fool visitors. I want to sit with that for a second. Superman, in his secret Arctic base, maintained a decoy bedroom for his own fake identity, in case someone dropped by, in the Arctic. Anyway, Doc Savage got there first, and Superman moved in later. Now, the newspaper. Clark Kent does not, originally, work at the Daily Planet. He works at the Daily Star. The Planet arrived in 1940 and gradually replaced it, and the Star hung about for decades afterwards in the alternate universe corners of DC continuity as the paper of the older Superman. Perry White isn't in Action Comics number 1 either. The original editor was a chap called George Taylor. Perry came from the radio show, which had rather more use for a bellowing authority figure than the early comics did, because on radio, a shouting boss is free, and a collapsing building costs you a sound effects budget. Jimmy Olsen is the same story. The office boy exists in scattered early comics appearances without much identity, but Jimmy, as a named recurring character with a personality, is largely a radio creation, and for a very practical reason. Superman on the radio is a problem. He's a man who mostly thinks and then does things silently, and very fast. That's terrible audio. What you need is somebody for him to talk to, ideally somebody younger than him, who asks a lot of questions and gets into trouble. So they built one, which is also, incidentally, why Jimmy ends up with a signal watch. On radio, you need an audible way for the plot to summon Superman. A watch that goes ZZZ is a gift to a sound engineer. Then there's the phrase, "Look, up in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's Superman." That's a scripted piece of call and response, 3 separate voices, written for broadcast. It's not a caption box, it's a crowd, and it only makes sense as a crowd, which is why it always sounds slightly odd when a comic tries to print it. Truth, justice, and the American way is a broadcast era phrase as well, hardened into place by the wartime radio show and then cemented by the 1950s television series. It's not from 1938. In 2021, DC changed it to Truth, Justice, and a Better Tomorrow, which caused a certain amount of noise online, though I'd gently point out that a phrase which has already been rewritten several times over 80 years is not exactly a sacred text. And then there's the one that genuinely floored me when I found it, so I've saved it for last. Superman didn't grow up on a farm. I mean, he does now, and he did originally, in the sense that Action Comics #1 gives him a passing infancy in a rural sort of nowhere. But through most of the Silver Age, the Superboy stories, which is where the childhood actually got filled in and detailed, the Kents were not farmers. They ran a shop, the Kent General Store in downtown Smallville, introduced in Superboy #6 in 1950, with young Clark working there after school. For years and years, the defining image of Superman's upbringing was not a barn and a wheat field. It was a lad stacking shelves. It never took. The public consciousness simply refused to accept it, and the 1978 film and John Byrne's 1986 relaunch both put the Kents firmly back on a farm, and there they've stayed. But there's a whole generation's worth of comics where Superman's origin story involves retail. I love that, partly because it's funny, and partly because it's a genuinely useful reminder of how this stuff works. None of it was locked. It was a monthly product made by working people under deadline, and things got tried. And the ones that stuck for reasons that had nothing to do with anyone's grand design, and everything to do with which version people happened to like the look of. 2 more bits of furniture worth mentioning while we're at it. The place names. Metropolis and Smallville are almost aggressively unspecific, and that's deliberate. Metropolis just means large city. Smallville means small town. These are not names so much as labels, and they let the stories float free of any actual American geography, which matters enormously for a character being sold to children in every state at once. Nobody's local paper is being insulted. Nobody's town is the boring one. And then there are the glasses. The disguise gets mocked relentlessly, and I think unfairly. The argument against it is that a pair of spectacles cannot possibly conceal an identity. The argument for it, which the stories themselves make repeatedly, and which I find fairly persuasive, is that the glasses are the smallest part of it. Clark's shoulders come forward. His voice goes up. He's nervous, he apologizes, he backs out of rooms. He is, in every respect except the physical facts, a completely different person to be in a room with. There's also a fairly ruthless piece of social observation buried in it. Nobody looks closely at the mild bloke from the office. That's the actual disguise. The glasses are just where you hang it. Later versions added an extra layer where the lenses are made from the rocket's windscreen, so his X-ray vision is partly contained by them, which is a nice bit of tidying up, but wasn't needed. The original worked fine on the strength of people not paying attention, which is the most realistic thing in the entire mythology. Which brings us to the period where the people trying things were doing so, with the government reading over their shoulder. So imagine you're an editor at a comics publisher in the spring of 1945, and the phone goes, and it's the War Department, and they'd like a word about your strong man. That's happened more than once. Here's the context you need. During the war, the US Office of Censorship ran a near-total blackout on anything touching atomic research, because the Manhattan Project was in progress and nobody wanted a physicist in Berlin working out what all these American scientists had suddenly stopped publishing about. The forbidden vocabulary was remarkably broad. Atomic power, atomic fission, atom smashing, cyclotrons, betatrons, any reference to basic atomic research at all. Science journalists who'd spent years writing about uranium simply changed subject overnight, and the newspapers went quiet. The censors were, by the accounts that survive, twitchy in a way that went beyond hard facts. An offhand joke about atomic energy worried them roughly as much as a technical detail, because the concern wasn't only leakage. It was that if the public started casually chatting about atom bombs, someone might start wondering why. Which brings us to Superman, who kept wandering into it. The first incident involved a story called Battle of the Atoms, scheduled for Superman number 34 in early 1945. Lex Luthor builds a device, calls it an atomic bomb, and lobs it at Superman to no effect whatsoever, which is about as unserious a treatment of nuclear physics as you could design. There's a suggestion in some accounts that the drawn device was uncomfortably close in size to the actual plutonium core the Americans were building, which, if true, is one of the great coincidences in publishing. The War Department asked them to hold it, and they held it for about 8 months. The story finally saw print well after the bombs had actually been dropped on Japan, at which point there was obviously nothing left to protect. The second incident is the famous one, and it's better. In April 1945, the writer Alvin Schwartz and the artist Wayne Boring produced a sequence for the syndicated Superman newspaper strip in which a skeptical physics professor decides to test whether this Superman fellow is really as invulnerable as he claims. His method is to stick him in a cyclotron, a particle accelerator, an atom smasher, and blast him with 3 million electron volts of particles. Superman, being Superman, is completely fine. The government was not completely fine. Agents got in touch. The Office of Censorship wrote to the MacLeod Syndicate and, while insisting rather primly that it did not censor comic strips, suggested it would be dangerous to continue with the storyline. Newsweek later summed it up with a line I think is genuinely funny, that Superman could withstand a 3 million volt bombardment from a cyclotron, but what he couldn't take was the Office of Censorship. Now there's a popular version of this story where the government forced them to cut the plot short and swerve into a story about Superman playing college baseball, which sounds absurd enough to be true. It appears to be wrong. Comics historians who've gone back through the actual printed strips found the baseball material was already woven in, and the whole thing transitions perfectly smoothly, which strongly suggests the cyclotron story was simply finished by the time anyone official got round to complaining. Time and Newsweek reported the opposite of each other at the time, which is a very 1945 sort of problem. There's a lovely postscript. In 1948, Harper's published a previously confidential memo written in 1945 by a lieutenant colonel called John R. Lansdale Jr., laying out the War Department's discomfort with all of this. And the memo's actual conclusion is beautifully bureaucratic. They didn't have the manpower to read every comic book in America. So the proposal was to approach the publishers and ask them please to police themselves, which they did, and which, less than a decade later, the industry would be doing on a far grander scale for entirely different reasons. Since we're in the 1940s radio and comics world anyway, there's one more thing from this period worth talking about, and it's the arc people most often bring up when they want to argue that this character has mattered in the actual world. In June 1946, The Adventures of Superman ran a 16-part story called Clan of the Fiery Cross. It ran from the 10th of June to the 1st of July. Kellogg's was still the sponsor, and the villains are unmistakably the Ku Klux Klan, though they're never named as such. Hoods, burning crosses, the lot. The plot runs through Jimmy Olsen and an amateur baseball game, and centres on a man trying to pull his young nephew into the organisation, while the two of them target a Chinese-American boy on the team. The material behind it came from a folklorist and activist called Stetson Kennedy, and Kennedy is a complicated figure, so let me put this carefully. The version that circulates has him as a lone infiltrator who joined up undercover, gathered the secrets, and walked them straight over to the producers. Historians have picked at a fair amount of that since, and quite a bit of his account of his own involvement doesn't hold up as cleanly as it once did. What isn't in doubt is that real specific material reached those writers through him. Code words, rituals, internal terminology, the small proprietary details that gave the group its air of secret significance. The strategy built on it was not to defeat anybody dramatically, It was to make them look ridiculous by broadcasting their sacred nonsense to every child in America between cereal adverts. Local stations reportedly received threatening letters before it aired. It aired anyway. The ratings were excellent, and Kellogg's held its nerve. The other thing to be honest about is the effect. The framing you'll usually meet, which owes a great deal to a chapter in Freakonomics, hands the broadcast most of the credit for the Klan's post-war collapse, and that's rather more weight than the evidence carries. A good many other things were happening to that organisation at the same time. What I'd say instead is smaller, and, I think, sturdier. A hugely popular children's programme, sponsored by a cereal company, chose in 1946 to spend 3 weeks pointing and laughing at them, and somebody in an office had to put their name to that decision. It wasn't a one-off either. It sat inside a deliberate shift in what the programme was doing after the war ended. Through the war years, the show had an obvious enemy to point at, and once that enemy was gone, the producers had a genuine problem. What is a hero for in peacetime on a children's serial? The answer they landed on was social prejudice, and they ran a run of stories on it. There's an arc called the Hate Mongers Organisation that precedes the Klan material and works on similar ground, going after a group whipping up hatred against immigrants for its own profit. That thinking spilled over into print as well. There's a series of posters from around 1949 and 1950 distributed to American schools, showing Superman standing with a group of children and telling them, in essence, that if anyone tries to divide them by race or religion, that person is the un-American one. They hung in actual classrooms. I find those posters more interesting than the radio arc, honestly, because a radio serial is entertainment with a message attached, whereas a poster on a classroom wall is somebody deciding this character has enough moral authority with children to be used as an instructor. That's a strange amount of weight to put on a comic book strongman 11 years after he first appeared. It's also, I think, the point where the character stops being a product and starts being a symbol, with everything that comes with that. Once you're a symbol, everyone gets an opinion about what you should stand for, and every subsequent generation gets to argue about whether the current version is doing it properly. Those arguments have never stopped. They were happening in 1946, and they were happening last summer. At some point in the 1950s and 60s, Superman could move a planet, not lift a car, not stop a train, push an actual world out of its actual orbit, with his hands in space, without any real explanation of what he was bracing against. And that image is the one I always come back to when people talk about the Silver Age, because it tells you exactly what pressure the character was under. Here's the mechanism, and I promise it's less mysterious than it looks. Superman was appearing in multiple monthly titles simultaneously for decades, aimed largely at children who cycled through the audience every few years. Every single issue had to contain a surprise, and when your hero's defining trait is that he wins, the only variable you can actually turn up is the scale of the winning. They turned it up, constantly, for 20-odd years, and what accumulated is one of the strangest ability lists in fiction. Let's do some of them, because they're marvellous. Super ventriloquism. Superman could throw his voice enormous distances with perfect accuracy, which was mostly used to protect his secret identity by making it sound like Clark Kent was talking from somewhere else, while Superman stood in plain view. Super hypnosis, which did roughly what you'd expect and which existed largely because sometimes a story needed everyone in a room to forget something, and there wasn't time to invent a machine. Super weaving. He could weave fabric at extraordinary speed using his invulnerable fingers, which is how he made spare costumes, and which raises the question of where he got invulnerable thread, and the answer is that he didn't, and you shouldn't think about it. Super breath, which started as blowing very hard and eventually became a freezing weapon capable of stopping a river. Then the amnesia kiss. Superman could remove a specific memory from a person's mind by kissing them. That one gets attributed to the 1980 film constantly, and I understand why, because the film is where most people encountered it. But it's a comics device first, and it is, when you stop and think about it for even 2 seconds, an absolutely appalling thing for a hero to be able to do. It's presented as a tidy solution. Somebody found out the secret. Kiss it away, off we go. Then there's the kryptonite situation, which got completely out of hand, and which I find delightful. Green kryptonite is the standard one. It weakens him, and given enough time, it kills him. Fine, sensible, does the job. But if you're publishing 3 titles a month, and green kryptonite is your reliable plot lever, you're going to wear it out fast. So they added colours. Red kryptonite, which is the good one. Red kryptonite does something unpredictable to Superman, and crucially, it never does the same thing twice, and the effect wears off after a day or 2. That's not a weakness. That's a license to print any story you fancy. It's why there are comics where Superman grows a 3rd eye in the back of his head, where he turns into a giant ant, where he becomes evil for an afternoon, where he splits into 2 people. All of it hangs off a rock defined as doing something different every time. Gold kryptonite removes his powers permanently, which made it terrifying and therefore extremely rare. Blue kryptonite affects Bizarro rather than Superman, which is a beautifully specific bit of design. White kryptonite kills plant life, which is oddly grim and mostly turned up when they needed a threat that wasn't about him at all. And dual kryptonite, which amplifies the psychic abilities of Phantom Zone criminals, and which is such a narrow, specific, plot-shaped invention that I find it genuinely charming. Which brings us to Bizarro, who deserves a moment. He starts as an imperfect duplicate, a flawed copy of Superman with chalk white skin and broken speech, and by the time the concept has fully bloomed, he has an entire planet. Ktray, which is Earth backwards, and it's a cube, because of course it is. On Ktray, everything works in reverse. Ugliness is beauty, failure is success, and their legal system rewards crime. There is a Bizarro version of essentially everyone. And Mr. Marcy's Patulk, the imp from the 5th dimension, whom you can only get rid of by tricking him into saying or writing his own name backwards, which means huge numbers of Superman stories from this era are not fights at all. They're the world's strongest man attempting to trick a small magical pest into reading something aloud. I want to be clear that I'm not sneering at any of this. I know the register of the Silver Age invites sneering, and I think that's a mistake. Half of what gets laughed at now was written under conditions no modern writer would accept. 8 pages a day, no revisions, a cover already printed that you have to explain. These are inventive, fast, weird little stories made by people solving a genuinely difficult problem, which is how to keep an invincible character interesting month after month for 2 decades. The answer they landed on was stop making it about whether he can win and start making it about what strange shape the problem takes. That's a smart answer. It's just also how you end up with a superhorse. Before we do though, the robots. Superman had robot duplicates of himself. Plural. Quite a lot of them stored in the fortress, built by him, capable of impersonating him or Clark Kent convincingly enough to fool anyone, and deployed constantly whenever a story required Superman and Clark to be seen in the same room. Which they did frequently, because Lois Lane spent roughly 15 years attempting to prove they were the same person. That's the actual plot of an enormous number of stories from this period. She suspects, she devises a test, and Superman defeats the test by some increasingly elaborate method, and the robots were the most common one. She has a scheme, a robot turns up, she's satisfied, back to work. It's a slightly odd dynamic to look at now. She is a good reporter, correctly identifying a true fact and being systematically gaslit by a man who is technically the hero of the story. There's also the Superman Revenge Squad, which is precisely what it sounds like. an organization of aliens from various worlds, unified entirely by a shared grudge against one man, meeting to coordinate schemes against him. Not a threat to Earth, not conquerors, just a support group with an agenda. I've a great deal of affection for this era's willingness to just name a thing what it is: the Superman Revenge Squad, the Legion of Super Pets, the Fortress of Solitude. No mystique, no clever misdirection, the label tells you the whole contents. It's the same instinct that gave us Metropolis and Smallville, and I think it comes from writing for readers who might be picking up their first ever comic and can't be expected to work anything out. And yes, we're doing the horse next. Crypto is a dog from Krypton. That's not a joke setup, that's just a situation. Jor-El, before launching his son off the doomed planet, tested the rocket prototype on the family dog, and the test rocket got knocked off course and drifted through space for years before eventually arriving on Earth, where the dog turned out to have all of Superman's powers, because dogs from Krypton work the same as people from Krypton. He wears a cape, he flies, he has heat vision. Once you've got a flying dog, the rest follows with a sort of terrible logic. Streaky is the cat. Streaky belonged to Supergirl and got his powers from exposure to a variant of kryptonite that Supergirl had been experimenting on. He is an orange tabby who can fly. He is, on balance, my favourite of them, because a cat with superpowers is exactly as unhelpful as you'd expect a cat with superpowers to be. Beppo is the monkey. Beppo was a test animal in Jor-El's laboratory who stowed away on the rocket. The actual rocket. The one carrying the baby, which means one telling of the origin has the last survivors of a dead civilization being an infant and a chimp who snuck aboard. And then there's Comet. Comet is a horse. Comet has superpowers. So far, so consistent. But Comet's backstory is that he was originally a centaur in ancient Greece named Byron, who was transformed into a horse by a sorceress and later granted immortality and various powers, and who can, under certain conditions of comet activity, temporarily become human. He also had feelings for Supergirl, who at other times rode him. I'm going to move briskly past that, as I think most sensible people do, and simply note that it exists, that it was published, that the man who wrote it was being paid by the page and working to a deadline, and that comics in this period were not being scrutinized by anyone the way they are now. It's an Iceberg staple for obvious reasons. It's also, honestly, less an act of deliberate strangeness than an act of a writer following his own premise off a cliff. The four of them, plus a few others depending on the story, eventually got formalized as the Legion of Super Pets, which held meetings. Right, let's talk about the actual architecture of Krypton, because the Silver Age built a lot of it, and most of it is genuinely good. The bottled city of Kandor is the big one. Kandor was the capital of Krypton, and before the planet was destroyed, the android villain Brainiac shrank it and put it in a bottle and took it with him, as part of his general practice of collecting cities from worlds he intended to see destroyed. Superman recovers the bottle and keeps it in the fortress, which means that for years there was a functioning Kryptonian city with a population of living Kryptonians sitting on a shelf in his house. He couldn't fix it. That's the point of Kandor. It's a permanent unfinished job, a whole surviving fragment of his home, right there, and enlarging it safely is beyond him. He's the strongest man alive, and there's a bottle in his living room he can't open. Inside the bottle, incidentally, Superman and Jimmy Olsen operated as a costume duo called Nightwing and Flamebird. Kryptonian mythology gave them the names. Superman had no powers in there, because the bottle simulated Krypton's red sun conditions, so the world's most powerful being fought crime in Kandor as an ordinary man in a mask with a sidekick. If that setup sounds familiar, that's because it is. And yes, Nightwing as a name eventually made its way over to another corner of DC entirely. There's also the Phantom Zone, which is where Krypton put its criminals. Not a prison in the physical sense, a dimension, of pure existence where you don't age, don't eat, can't touch anything, and can observe the real world without being able to affect it. Kryptonian society decided that indefinite, conscious, weightless nothing was the humane alternative to execution, which is a judgment call I'd want to see the paperwork on, and Clercore, which I include purely because I enjoy it. Clercore is a Kandorian martial art, a hand-to-hand combat discipline developed by a civilization of people who, under a yellow sun, could throw a mountain. It only makes sense inside the bottle, where nobody has powers, which is precisely why it exists. The thing I take from all of this is that the writers of this era were world-building at a furious pace without any of the modern apparatus for it. No continuity department, no Bible, no long-term plan. Somebody needed a thing, so they invented a thing, and if readers liked it, it stayed. Crypto stayed. Kandor stayed. A remarkable proportion of what people now think of as core Superman mythology was somebody's throwaway solution to next month's deadline. One more Kryptonian survivor deserves a proper mention here, because she's the biggest thing this era produced, and she nearly wasn't allowed to exist in public. Supergirl arrives in 1959. Kara Zor-El, Superman's cousin from Argo City, a chunk of Krypton that survived the destruction under a protective dome before eventually failing too. Her rocket lands, Superman finds her, and everything's fine. Except it isn't, because his first decision is to hide her. For a considerable stretch of stories, Supergirl's existence is a secret from the world. She's placed in an orphanage under an assumed name, with a brown wig, told to use her powers only in private, and kept in reserve as what the stories openly describe as Earth's secret emergency weapon. The reasoning offered is protective, that she needs training and that enemies would target her. And she goes along with it, because she's a teenager and he's the only family she has left. Read that back and it's quite a lot, isn't it? The last survivor of a dead world finds another survivor and immediately files her away. She eventually gets revealed to the world and gets her own life, and becomes one of the most durable characters DC has. But the hidden years are there in print, and they're a proper reminder that the Silver Age wasn't all sunshine. It could be surprisingly cold, in an offhand way, without ever seeming to notice it was being cold. Crypto, meanwhile, spent a fair chunk of that period living with her, which does at least mean the dog got a decent run, and a fair few of them stayed in a rather more roundabout way, which we'll get to at the end, because the fellow who bottled Kandor in 1958 has a film coming out. There's a cover from this era where Superman is standing over Jimmy Olsen, who is on the floor, and Superman is quite clearly about to do something appalling to him. There's another where he's apparently getting married to a gorilla. There's one where he's dumping Lois Lane out of a window. There's one where he appears to be selling crypto to a passing stranger. These are all real. There are hundreds of them, and the internet has spent about 2 decades collecting them under the general heading of Superman being a terrible person, which is very funny and also completely misunderstands what's going on. Here's what's going on. A comic in 1962 was sold from a spinner rack, not a shelf where the covers face out in a neat row. A wire carousel, usually in a chemist or a corner shop, holding 60 or 70 titles, most of them obscured by the others, being spun by a 9-year-old with a limited attention span and about a dime to his name. You had roughly 1 second. Not 1 second to make a good impression. 1 second to make the child stop spinning. The reliable way to do that, it turned out, was to show the most familiar and trustworthy figure in the child's world doing something that made absolutely no sense. Confusion stops the carousel. A cover of Superman rescuing someone doesn't, because that's just Tuesday. The covers were frequently designed first in an editorial meeting, and then handed to a writer whose job was to construct a story that made the image make sense. That's the actual production order. The betrayal on the cover always turns out to be a trick, or a hypnosis, or a red kryptonite afternoon, or a robot duplicate, and it always resolves in the final panel. The cover was a promise of weirdness, and the story was the apology. Which brings us neatly to the imaginary story, one of my favourite bits of publishing machinery ever devised. An imaginary story was a comic explicitly labelled as not counting. The characters could get married, have children, grow old, change permanently, die. And then the following month, everything was exactly as before, because it never happened. Modern comics do this constantly and give it grander names, but the Silver Age version had a wonderful bluntness to it. It said right at the top that none of this was real, which is a strange thing to tell a reader of a comic about a man from an exploded planet, and which is precisely the joke Alan Moore was making decades later when he wrote that aren't they all imaginary? And doesn't that make them true anyway? The big one is Superman Red and Superman Blue from 1963, where Superman splits into two separate beings, Red and Blue, who between them solve absolutely everything. They cure disease, they fix candor, they end war, they each marry a different woman. It is the single most optimistic Superman story ever printed, and it is stamped as not counting, which is either heartbreaking or the whole point, depending on your mood. There's a Death of Superman from 1961 as well, written by Jerry Siegel, 30 years before the famous one. Luthor kills him, he actually dies. It's imaginary, so it doesn't hold, but Siegel wrote his own creation's death, and did it decades before anyone else got the idea. Right, let's do the adaptations that time has mercifully buried, because there are some real gems. In 1958, somebody at the production company made a pilot called The Adventures of Superpup. The premise is that it's Superman, except everybody is a dog. Not animated, live action. Performed by actors in full-body dog costumes with enormous papier-mâché heads. Superman is Bark Bent. Lois Lane is Pamela Poodle. The villain is a rat called Professor Sheepdip. I have watched it. I'd encourage you not to, in the same way I'd encourage you not to look directly at an eclipse. But I'd also say that it is a genuinely fascinating artifact of a moment when television executives had absolutely no idea what would work and were prepared to try anything. It never aired. Obviously, it never aired. There was also a Superboy pilot in 1961 that similarly went nowhere, and which is interesting mostly because it shows how early people were trying to spin the character off into other formats. In 1966, Broadway got involved. It's a Bird, It's a Plane, It's Superman was an actual stage musical, with actual songs, staged in an actual theatre in New York. It didn't run long, but it had a genuine composer and lyricist behind it, and it exists in the same year as the Batman television series, which tells you something about the cultural moment. For a couple of years in the mid-60s, the entire mainstream approach to superheroes was that they were funny, and that everybody was in on the joke, and that the correct register was camp. That passed, obviously, but it passed less completely than people think. The thing that made Superpup possible, incidentally, was that television had already worked out that this character sold. The Adventures of Superman ran on American television through the 50s, with George Reeves in the part, and it was enormous. Not a modest success, an absolute fixture, the thing children ran home for. Reeves became, for a decade, the face most people pictured. He'd been a serious actor with proper film credits behind him, and he ended up so completely identified with the role that it defined the rest of his working life, which is a pressure I don't think anyone in 1951 had a framework for understanding. There's a story from that era that I think about often. Reeves attended public appearances in costume, as you'd expect, and at some point the concern arose that children were going to hurt themselves trying to copy what they'd seen. The sponsor and the production took it seriously enough that Reeves reportedly made a point of telling kids directly that he was an actor, that the suit was a costume, and that they should absolutely not attempt any of it. Imagine being asked to do that. You've spent all week being the strongest man in the world for an audience who believe it completely, and then you have to stand in front of them and dismantle it for their own safety. The programme also softened noticeably once it moved to colour in its later seasons. Villains stopped dying, the violence got gentler, the plots got sillier, which is the same drift you see happening in the comics at exactly the same moment. And it's not a coincidence because both were chasing the same, increasingly young audience, and both were operating under the same nervous cultural mood about what children were being shown. Every time somebody insists Superman must be grim to be taken seriously, I think about the fact that at one point he was played by a man in a dog suit, and I feel a bit better about the whole enterprise. In 1946, the 10-year contract to produce Superman material was coming to its end, and Siegel and Schuster went to court to try to have the original agreement annulled and get the character back. They lost the central point. In 1948, the matter settled, and National paid them $94,013.16 for the Superman and Superboy rights, which was a substantial amount of money in 1948, and which was obviously not remotely close to what the property was worth even then. And then the other thing happened, which mattered more. The bylines came off. For the first decade, Superman comics carried the line saying who made them. After the lawsuit, that stopped. Their names came off the character they had invented, and the two of them were no longer working on it. And for practical purposes, the industry treated them as a problem that had been resolved. I've thought about this a fair bit, and I keep landing on the same place. The money in that settlement was real money. It wasn't nothing. But money runs out, and a name on a page doesn't. And I think anybody who's ever made something would understand instinctively which of those two things stings more to lose. Siegel drifted through the industry afterwards, taking work where he could get it, including a stretch back at DC in the late 50s and 60s, under conditions that must have been extraordinarily strange. He wrote Superman stories again, as a freelancer, on the character he'd created, for the company he'd sued, uncredited. Schuster had it harder, largely because of his eyes. His eyesight had been deteriorating for years, and for an artist that's not a setback, it's the end of the road. He kept working as long as he could, and then increasingly couldn't. And by the early 50s, he was taking anonymous freelance work wherever he could get it, drawing for tiny under-the-counter outfits that paid cash and asked no questions and printed no credits. That work stayed anonymous for the rest of his life. He never mentioned it to anyone. It was only decades later, long after his death, that a comics historian named Craig Yo came across one of those old booklets, looked at the line work and recognised the hand. The way the faces were built, the way the figures stood. He'd spent his career learning to identify artists by their marks, and there in a piece of forgotten cheap printing from 1954 was unmistakably the man who drew Action Comics #1. There's something about that discovery that I find genuinely moving, and it's got nothing to do with the content of the booklets. It's that the style survived. He was broke and half blind, and working for people whose names nobody remembers, on material he'd never put his name to, and the hand was still recognisably his. You couldn't take that off him. Now the good part, because there is one. In 1975, Warner announced they were making a big-budget Superman film. Enormous money, serious stars, the works. And a group of comics professionals looked at that announcement and then looked at the circumstances the two creators were actually living in and decided this was not going to stand. The campaign was organised largely by Jerry Robinson and Neil Adams. Robinson was a legend of the field in his own right. Adams was one of the most respected artists working, and neither of them had any obligation to get involved. What they did was straightforward, and, in a business built on quiet arrangements, quite brave. They made noise. They went to the press. They made sure that every article about the shiny new Superman film had a paragraph in it about how the men who made him were doing. Siegel wrote a long public statement about it that got widespread coverage. It's not a subtle document, it's a furious one. And it worked, which is the bit I find remarkable. It worked because a corporation about to spend an unprecedented amount of money on a story about the world's most decent man could not really afford to be photographed being the villain of that story. The settlement gave both men pensions of around $20,000 a year, with medical coverage, and it restored the credit. From that point onwards, on the comics, on the films, on essentially everything, the line appears. Superman, created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. It's on the 1978 film. It's on every film since. It's on the one that came out last year. $20,000 a year is not a fortune, and I'm not going to pretend the arrangement was generous relative to what the character earned. But I'd say the credit was the actual win. It's the thing that couldn't be spent, and it's the thing that's still there. A quick word on how the two of them ended up, because it's not a footnote to me. Siegel lived to see the film. He was there for the premiere period, he saw the credit go up, and he spent the years afterwards as an elder figure of the industry, invited places, asked about it, treated as what he actually was. He died in 1996. Shuster died in 1992. Both of them, by the end, were being publicly and consistently identified as the creators of Superman, which had not been true for the better part of 30 years in the middle of their lives. The arrangements carried on after them. The Shuster estate received an annual stipend of $25,000 under an agreement reached shortly after his death, and that agreement would turn out to matter enormously later on, though nobody involved at the time can have known quite how much. And the campaign changed things beyond these two men. It's genuinely difficult to overstate how much the creator credit situation in American comics shifted in the decades that followed. And a lot of that traces back to 1975 and the precedent that a public campaign could actually work. Not because the industry had a change of heart particularly, but because it had been demonstrated that this was now a story journalists would print. Creator credits on adaptations, royalty arrangements, the return of original artwork to the artists who drew it. All of that was fought for separately, and none of it arrived neatly, but the door got opened by two comics professionals deciding that the men who made Superman deserved better, and going to the papers about it. I think that's worth stating plainly, because the version of this story that circulates online is usually a straightforward tragedy. And it isn't. It's a tragedy with a decent third act. And since we're on the subject of that 1978 film, which is where an awful lot of the modern Superman comes from, let's talk about the films, including a startling number that never got made at all. Marlon Brando was paid several $1 million, plus a share of the profits, to appear in the 1978 Superman for about 10 minutes at the start of the film. That figure was, at the time, one of the largest sums ever paid to an actor, and it was for a supporting role in a comic book adaptation, which in 1977 was not a genre anybody took remotely seriously. The producers wanted respectability, and the fastest way to buy respectability was to buy the most respected actor alive and put his face on the poster. It worked, incidentally, and the film is still the version most people carry around in their heads. But the interesting thing about the 1978 production is that it establishes the pattern for absolutely everything that follows, which is that Superman films are enormous, expensive, difficult to make, and prone to going catastrophically off the rails. Superman 4 is where that becomes undeniable. By then the rights had passed to Canon Films, an outfit whose entire business model was making a very large number of very cheap films very quickly. Christopher Reeve agreed to come back, partly in exchange for creative input on the story, which is how you end up with a Superman film about nuclear disarmament. Canon then ran into financial trouble, and the budget was cut severely during production. You can see it in the finished thing. Effect sequences that plainly cost about £11, sets reused from one scene to the next, a flying rig that isn't fooling anyone. It's not a film that failed because nobody cared. It's a film that failed because the money vanished underneath it. Then the character went into a strange decade where the film stopped and the comics did something drastic. The death of Superman in 1992 is one of the biggest publishing events in the history of the medium, and the origin of it is much more mundane than the story deserves. The plan for a good while had been to marry Clark and Lois in the comics. Everything had been building towards it. And then a television series called Lois and Clark went into production, and the studio wanted the wedding to happen on television and wanted the comics to hold off so the two could line up, which left the comics team with a hole in the schedule where a wedding used to be and a need to fill it with something. The story goes, and it's been told by several people who were in the room in slightly different versions, that somebody in a plotting meeting said, more or less as a joke, well, let's just kill him then. And everyone stopped. And it wasn't a joke anymore. So the biggest comic story of the decade exists because a television schedule got in the way. That's it. That's the whole reason. What followed was Reign of the Supermen, 4 replacement Supermen, none of whom were him, and then his return, complete with the mullet, which is the single most 1993 thing that has ever happened to a fictional character. He came back with long hair because he'd been dead and nobody had cut it, which is an in-story explanation I respect enormously for how hard it commits to a bad idea. And then 1997, when they turned him into electricity, blue, contained in a suit, splitting into 2 beings at one point, which is a nod back to the imaginary story from decades before, though I doubt many readers at the time were making that connection. It lasted about a year. Nobody talks about it. I quite like that it happened. Right, the films that don't exist. Superman Lives is the great one. Tim Burton directing. Nicolas Cage as Superman. John Peters producing. And Peters is the crucial ingredient here, because his notes have become legend. Kevin Smith, who wrote an early draft, has told the story on stage for years, and the notes as he describes them include that Superman shouldn't fly, that he shouldn't wear the suit, and that there should be a giant spider in the 3rd act. Cage was cast, costume tests were shot, the photographs exist and they are extraordinary. A long-haired Cage in a suit that looks like nothing anyone had seen before. And then Warner got nervous about the budget, and the whole thing collapsed, having already spent an enormous amount of money on a film that would never exist. I'll say something mildly unpopular here. I don't think it would have been a disaster. I think it would have been strange and divisive and quite possibly bad, but Burton at that point in his career was making genuinely peculiar and personal work inside enormous budgets, and Cage is an actor who commits absolutely to whatever he's decided the part is. A Superman film that people are still arguing about 30 years later is not the worst outcome available. There's also J.J. Abrams' Superman, Flyby, from the early 2000s, in which Krypton does not explode. It survives. There's a civil war on it. Kal-El is sent to Earth as part of a prophecy, and he goes back at the end. That draft has been read by a lot of people over the years, and the reaction is generally that it's an interesting science fiction film that happens to have Superman's name on it. And there was a proposal in the late 90s, usually called Superman 2000, put together by several of the best writers in comics at the time, laying out how they'd relaunch the character. It didn't happen either, though pieces of that thinking made their way into work those writers did later on. There's one more unmade one I'll mention, mostly because of who was attached. In the early 2000s, there was a version in development with Wolfgang Petersen that would have put Superman and Batman in the same film, decades before anyone actually did it. The script by Akiva Goldsman got fairly far along. It fell apart the way these things do, which is to say that the studio decided it preferred a different project and the calendar quietly swallowed it. And that's the honest shape of film development, by the way. Most scripts don't get rejected in some dramatic meeting. They just sit there while priorities move. And then one day, the person who championed them leaves the company, and the thing stops existing without anyone ever saying no. What I take from the whole pile is that the character absorbs failure remarkably well. Cannon ran out of money, the electricity phase went nowhere, at least 3 major films collapsed before shooting, and none of it stuck to him. Worth noting that the screen history goes back much further than 1978 as well. There were 2 film serials in 1948 and 1950 with Kirk Alyn in the part. Serials were the chapter-by-chapter adventures shown before the main feature, a cliffhanger a week, aimed squarely at children with pocket money. And they had a problem, which was flying. Nobody had a way to make a man fly convincingly on a serial budget. Their solution was to switch to animation whenever he took off. Live action. Kirk Alyn crouches, and then a cartoon Superman soars across the screen, and then live action, Alyn lands somewhere else. It's completely absurd, and audiences apparently accepted it without complaint, because audiences will accept nearly anything if the story is moving quickly enough. There's also a lovely bit of history where an earlier attempt at a Superman serial fell apart, and the production company reused the flying system it had developed for the sequences on a serial about Captain Marvel instead. Captain Marvel being, at the time, Superman's biggest competitor, and the subject of a lengthy legal dispute between the 2 publishers over how similar the characters were. So Superman's abandoned flying rig ended up carrying the rival through the air. I find that enormously funny. Then the modern run. Superman Returns arrived in 2006 after roughly a decade of the collapses we've just been through, and it's essentially a continuation of the 1978 films, made by someone who loved them. Man of Steel came in 2013 and went in a very different direction, considerably heavier and more somber, and it split people down the middle in a way that has never really resolved. And now we're on another version, again, which is the 4th or 5th complete restart depending on how you count. He just keeps arriving in the next version. The 1st of January, 2034. That's the date, and it's close enough now that people in the industry are talking about it openly rather than as a distant hypothetical. On that day, under current United States copyright law, Action Comics #1 enters the public domain. The rule is that works published before 1978 get 95 years if the required formalities were satisfied. The issue was copyrighted in 1938. The term runs out at the end of 2033. And on the first day of 2034, it's out. Now everybody's first reaction to this is that Superman becomes free. And that's not what happens. So let's be precise about it, because the precision is the interesting bit. What enters the public domain is the version of the character as he appears in that one issue, the 1938 Superman, the one who leaps rather than flies. Clark Kent goes too. Lois Lane goes too, since she's in that issue. What doesn't go is nearly everything else, and it doesn't go because it wasn't in that issue. Flight arrives in 1940, so Flight is still protected for another few years after that date. Lex Luthor first appears in 1940, Jimmy Olsen first appears in 1938. So does the Daily Planet. The heat-generating version of his X-ray vision turns up in 1949. Kryptonite hits the comics in 1949 as well. The Fortress in its Arctic form is 1958. Supergirl, Krypto, Brainiac, Kandor, all of them are on their own individual clocks, each one ticking down from its own first publication entirely separately. So what actually becomes available in 2034 is a very specific and quite limited thing. A strong man in a cape who jumps. And then there's Trademark, which is the part almost everybody forgets, and which is far more significant in practice than the copyright question. Copyright expires. Trademark doesn't, so long as you keep using it. The name is trademarked. The shield is trademarked. So is the costume design. So is the title action comics. And every one of those is in active daily use, and will still be in active daily use then. So the actual position is that you might legally own the right to reprint a 13-page story from 1938, and you would still find yourself explaining that to a legal department with considerably more money than you have. You would probably be safe reprinting the original issues. Beyond that, you would be finding out how much you enjoy litigation. Underneath all this, there's been a legal argument running for the better part of 30 years, and it's still not entirely finished. There's a bit of American copyright law that exists more or less for exactly this situation. The idea is that if you sign something away at the start of your career, before anybody has the faintest notion what it's worth, you or your family get a window decades later to take it back. Which is, I think, a decent piece of law. Somebody looked at contracts like that one and thought, no, that shouldn't be permanent purely because the person holding the pen was young and skint. The Siegel heirs filed to use it, so did the Schuster side, and the resulting cases ran for years through the American courts, turning on questions that are much drier than the underlying story deserves. The crucial one was an agreement the Schuster estate entered into in 1992, and whether that agreement had replaced the original 1938 grant with a new one. If it had, the clock had been reset, and the later termination notice was aimed at the wrong document. The appeals court agreed with the company on that point. More recently, the argument moved abroad, using reversion provisions in the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and Ireland, where under certain conditions rights can revert to an author's estate a set number of years after their death. It's a different legal route to a similar destination, and it applies to territories rather than to the American rights. Where it all lands, I genuinely don't know, and I'd be suspicious of anyone who claims they do. Jim Lee, who runs the creative side at DC, was asked about the 2034 date at a convention appearance, and gave what I think is actually the sensible answer. He said characters falling into the public domain is already happening. Everyone's seen the unsettling knockoffs of certain mice floating around online, and that the character isn't the magic. The storytelling is. He's right, and you can watch the proof of it in the box office. Last year's film took somewhere around $615 million worldwide, which made it the year's biggest superhero picture. The follow-up, Man of Tomorrow, is dated for the 9th of July 2027, and the antagonist is Brainiac. Which brings us all the way back to the bottle on the shelf, because Brainiac is the fellow who shrank Kandor in 1958 and has been waiting in the wings ever since. Not everything in that run has worked, mind. The Supergirl film in June came in around 126 million worldwide, which is not the number anybody wanted, which is its own kind of proof of Lee's point. Owning the character guarantees you nothing at all. So here's where I end up. In 1938, two young men signed away everything for a line item on an invoice, in a contract that said the rights were to be held forever. And forever, it turns out, has a date on it. Not because anyone won an argument, but because the law has a clock in it, and it's been running the whole time. If you want a preview of how 2034 might actually go, we've already had one, because a fairly famous mouse got there first. At the start of 2024, the earliest version of Mickey Mouse, the one from Steamboat Willie, entered the public domain in the United States on exactly the same 95-year rule. And what happened was not a flowering of new artistic interpretation. What happened mostly was a rush of low-effort horror films and grubby merchandise made by people who wanted the attention of doing it first, which is, I suspect, roughly what the first few months of 2034 will look like. Somebody will announce a horror film about a strong man in a cape within about a fortnight, and it will be terrible, and it will get more coverage than it deserves. But that's the noisy part, not the interesting part. The interesting part is slower, because a character in the public domain can be used by anyone, including people who'd never get near him otherwise, and including people in countries and traditions that have never had a crack at him. Somebody will do something genuinely good with a 1938 strongman who jumps. It just won't be in the first year, and it won't be the thing that trends. There's a small symmetry in that which I quite like. The thing got built in the first place, out of a pile of borrowed parts by two people who had no permission from anybody. A mistranslated word, a pulp hero's hideaway, a costume from the fairground. That arrangement becomes legal again, eventually, for whoever fancies having a go. Anyway, that's roughly where the law sits at the minute, and it'll almost certainly have shifted again before any of it actually matters. So that's the 12 layers, and I think what strikes me looking back over all of it is how little of it was planned. An animator thought jumping looked daft. A radio writer needed a way to tell a man where he came from. A new artist hadn't been briefed and drew someone hovering. An editor needed a cover feature by Friday. A government censor made a phone call. A production office needed something to fill the gap where a wedding used to be. And a bloke recognised a linework style in a booklet nobody was supposed to look at. None of that is destiny. All of it is people at work, mostly under deadline, mostly not thinking about the next 90 years. And the character we've ended up with is what accumulated on top of a strong man who jumps an eighth of a mile. There's plenty I didn't get to, incidentally. Krypton itself has enough in it for a whole video, all the different versions of how it died and who decided each one. Luthor has his own layers and his own iceberg, including how he ended up bald. And the Legion of Superheroes started as a fan club for Superboy and turned into 1,000 years of future history, which I genuinely enjoy digging into. And I never got round to the alternate versions, which is a whole shelf of its own. The one where the rocket lands in the Soviet Union instead of Kansas. The one that tells his entire life as 12 short chapters. The one where he's simply an ordinary bloke who happens to be able to do this. And the story is about the ordinary bloke rather than the powers. Another time though, that's more than enough for one night. Thanks for keeping me company.